WWF No Mercy is often heralded as the greatest wrestling game on the Nintendo 64. Some even label it the greatest grappler of all time. But why is that? What makes this game stand out amongst all the others? The next WWF game for the N64 was first announced in early 2000 after THQ's first venture with the World Wrestling Federation proved to be a success. That game, WrestleMania 2000, had quickly sold over 1 million copies, prompting a speedy return to the drawing board for publisher THQ and the hardworking development team at Aki. With a name for the project and a scheduled fourth quarter release, WWF No Mercy would hit US store shelves just a month after the pay-per-view event it shared its name with on November 17th, 2000. Now, it's important to note that while WrestleMania 2000 saw a Japanese release, No Mercy would be exclusive to the West, as over in Japan, they received a little game called Virtual Pro Wrestling 2. I don't know, you might have heard of it. I did a review on it not too long ago, so check it out if you're interested. 1999 was a hot year for the WWF, but by 2000 the company was Hot Pockets fresh out of the microwave, first bite with scolding filling type of hot. And this introduction does a fantastic job of recreating that excitement. The same way that the development team did for World Tour, Revenge, and WrestleMania 2000 prior to this. The biggest addition here, however, is the inclusion of voice clips, and while they are expectedly lower in quality due to the limitations of the hardware, it was still great to hear good old JR. And The Rock.
If you smell what The Rock is cooking.
Classic, very nostalgic, I love it. Let's take just a minute to not only appreciate this menu, but also the music that accompanies it.
Breaking, diggity dog.
As you navigate through different screens, you'll even notice the music change ever so slightly by adding new elements such as additional drums, vocals, and other instruments.
Survival is cooking. Know your role is cooking.
And I've always liked these types of menus that kind of move around an environment as you browse the available options. Other games like 1080 Snowboarding and Mickey's USA Speedway did this as well on the console, and it just feels really immersive. Now, one of the reasons the promotion was so incredibly popular during this time was the roster. WrestleMania 2000 boasted over 50 wrestlers to choose from, and No Mercy would hit us with just over 70. Keep in mind that just a few years earlier, wrestling games were quite limited when it came to the roster, so this was really impressive. Of course, we see mainstays like Austin, The Rock, Mankind, and Triple H here, with some of the other returning superstars including the likes of Al Snow, Bossman, Jericho, Kane, Ken Shamrock, New Age Outlaws, Test, and Shawn Michaels, amongst others. They would include updated versions of previous wrestlers like The Undertaker, making his American Badass video game debut here, just barely beating WWF Smackdown 2 Know Your Role, which was released just 3 days after this one, and Too Cool, who went from quite forgettable to one of the most recognizable tag teams in the company. We also see quite the level of noteworthy newcomers here, like British Bulldog, the Dudley Boys, Chris Benoit, Eddie Guerrero, Kurt Angle, Rikishi, and Taz all making their WWF debuts on the console, though some of them previously appeared in the WCW titles. The available women to choose from has jumped up to 14, and just check out these additions: the Fabulous Moolah, Mae Young, and Linda McMahon. That's right, the entire McMahon family is here and ready to rumble, pal. No Mercy would also mark the first Legends appearance of Andre the Giant, a feature that would become somewhat of a tradition as wrestling games would continue to evolve, and some of us today, myself included, buy the new WWE games strictly for the retro content. I mean, look, 120 frickin' bucks for the NWO. Non-wrestler inclusions such as Earl Hebner, Pat Patterson, Gerald Briscoe, The Fink, Paul Bearer, Michael Cole, and Jim Ross also made the cut. And while you probably weren't eagerly awaiting that WWF Championship reign as Earl Hebner, it was always rather entertaining to beat up on the likes of Michael Cole. A character model for The Big Show was created but ultimately removed during development due to his hiatus from the active roster at the time. His clothing was left in the game's create mode, and his facial texture can be accessed by way of a GameShark code. He was even supposed to be included in the game's story mode, but was replaced by Steven Richards of all people. So if you've ever played through and wondered why he felt so out of place, well, now you know. Each and every character model has been completely redesigned from the ground up, featuring new facial textures, hair options, and more detailed attires when compared to their WrestleMania 2000 counterparts. And speaking of attires, multiple slots return, which once again helps to expand on the already massive roster. So even though guys like Godfather and Val Venus had joined the right to censor, you still have the option to revert back to their previous gimmicks. And just like before, you have the freedom to edit each of these selections so you can completely customize your roster if you choose to do so. The Dead Man can become dead once again, the Boss Man can serve up hard time one more time, and the Kid can score the 1, 2, 3. Early footage and images of No Mercy showed full wrestler entrances, starting at the stage area and ending in the ring, as we'd seen in the previous two Aki titles for the console. But upon release, it was quickly realized that these entrances had been cut short, and there's still a bit of debate to this day on why this ultimately happened, with some claiming that they were removed due to lack of memory, and others noting time constraints behind the decision. Either theory is a possibility, but it's clear to see that in the beta versions, these entrances appeared to be very unpolished and even a bit glitchy, so it's very possible that the development team was running short on time and decided to focus their efforts elsewhere. Either way, what we do get looks rather nice with accurate taunts, some pretty cool lighting effects, pyro, theme songs, and Titantron videos. But it's a shame that they no longer display on the set designs, rather appearing here only as a full-screen version before the wrestler makes their way out of the curtain. The fact that wrestlers make their way to the ring with titles is a definite plus and something we hadn't seen before. But we don't see the tag team entrances from the previous two games return, which really is a shame. So yeah, entrances here aren't perfect, but for those of you that simply skip these anyway, you won't be bothered by these shortcomings. Gameplay doesn't differ too much here from its predecessor. We see the addition of a weight detection system, so moves by smaller wrestlers done on the super heavyweights look more realistic, or sometimes just don't happen at all. This adds yet another touch of realism to the sim-heavy formula that's made this gameplay so polished. We also see some minor tweaks, such as the addition of running grapples, which is such a natural fit to this game engine that I often go back to play the previous titles and forget that they didn't yet exist in those games. But for the most part, everything plays the same. One drawback here would be the occasional slowdown that wasn't present in the previous titles, which is due to the levels the hardware is being pushed, but it's not bad enough to ruin the gameplay experience. Just like before, strikes are performed with B, grapples with A, with light and heavy variations based on tapping and holding each button respectively. Different grapple moves are still mapped to each directional button, with the shoulder and C buttons handling actions like blocking, running, and pinning. Everything is still based around the rubber band style momentum system, which is indicated by the attitude meters, with one being featured for each wrestler. As the player successfully lands different strikes and moves, in addition to performing blocks, reversals, and taunts, this meter will begin to grow, while the opponents will decrease, eventually leading to the ability to pull off finishers. This is once again activated by taunting with the analog stick, entering into a strong grapple by holding A and tapping the analog stick once again. If the player is quick enough, multiple moves can be done before the time limit expires. How many stunners can I do with one special? Alright, come on. Give me another one. Yep. Come on, running out of time. God damn. Finishers are also mapped to multiple positions, so for those wrestlers that feature more than one finishing move or more than one variation of a finishing move, well, they can be achieved here. Jeff Hardy, for example, will perform a twist of fate from a front grapple, but a swanton bomb for the top rope. This feature dates back to World Tour and received most of its notoriety with the release of Revenge, where DDP had many different ways to hit the diamond cutter. At this point in the video, I'd like to stop and give props to the Super Pad Plus. Yes, it sucked. I mean, look at it. What is it even trying to be? But regardless, when it came time for me to get a second controller as a kid, this was what my mom ended up getting me. Obviously because it was cheaper and, in her mind, what's the difference? She's not a gamer. She doesn't understand these things. Anyway, I was a nice enough friend that I would let my buddies use the officially licensed controller while I used this one. And I have to say, this is one series of games where this thing actually shined. I wouldn't say I like it better than the official controller, but the bizarre layout pairs nicely with the button mapping in these Aki titles. Anyway, just had to share that. Now where were we? Oh yeah. With the addition of fresh wrestlers to the roster, we see quite a few new moves added to the game, like the angle slam, a new diving headbutt, the 3D, and the Taz mission. In addition to updated moves for some of the returning cast of characters, like the Last Ride, Farouk's Spinebuster, the Stink Face, and of course, the Worm. Even though that one is more so a taunt by the way it's performed, but nevertheless, it's here. Some of the basic moves like suplexes and scoop slams have even received an overhaul, adding even more to the catalog of maneuvers that has been growing every year at this point since World Tour. The wrestler-specific strikes are another one of the great features that carries over from the previous titles, which truly adds a sense of authenticity to these superstars. Austin's right hands, Road Dogg's jabs, X-Pac's kicks, Kane's uppercut, Bradshaw's clothesline from hell, they're all spot on here. It's amazing just how expansive this selection has become, and hopping into the game's create mode and opening the move assignment section really puts this into perspective. Arena selection is another big improvement here, with 10 available options, including 2 weekly shows. The first being Raw is War, featuring the recently updated set design with the Sidetrons and arched steel structures. And the second is Smackdown, which had just debuted prior to the release of WrestleMania 2000, so it wasn't seen in that game due to time constraints. In addition, we see a selection of pay-per-view events with the 1999 versions of Armageddon, No Mercy, SummerSlam, and Survivor Series, in addition to Backlash, King of the Ring, Royal Rumble, and WrestleMania, all from the year 2000. As the WWF started to grow as a product, so did the set designs, and it's nice to see them recreated with such detail here, like the guillotines of the Backlash stage, sadly though they don't move, and the massive Titantrons of the Raw and No Mercy designs. Arena lighting has also been touched up here, appearing slightly darker than previous titles, and touches like the addition of a ringside announce table, ring steps, and a more detailed crowd are all great inclusions helping to add to the look of the product seen on TV at the time. They even incorporated active Minitron movies for some of the stages, while unique lower thirds and ring areas help to finish off the overall look of the arenas. Though the gameplay visuals maintain the same presentation as WrestleMania 2000, we do see some minor upgrades here as well. As mentioned earlier, the wrestler models have all been redesigned from the ground up with all new textures featuring more detail and everything as a whole displaying with bolder colors. The camera angle has also been dropped down just slightly, displaying more of the stage area in the background, and this more straight-on perspective helps add some depth to the visuals. We still see the same clipping issues from previous installments, maybe even more so at times here, but again, I believe that most fans of the series have been able to look past these small technical difficulties, especially by this point. While most of the sounds haven't changed, we do hear a brand new referee voice for the first time.
1, 2, 3, pinfall!
And the soundtrack has strayed a bit from the hard rock, guitar-driven riffs that these games have been known for. Everything takes a slightly funkier influence here, with a lot more synth, hip-hop style beats, and record scratching included here. While I'm a huge fan of those classic tunes, especially those that appeared in World Tour, this is a nice departure from the norm and helped to add a very unique vibe to the overall presentation of this game. The typical match types present in the titles that preceded this one return here, with improvements being made in some occasions. Take the hardcore match for example. Not only are there a handful of new weapons available, I especially enjoyed beating my opponent with a bouquet of roses, but you can now drop them or put them down without them disappearing into the depths of hell. Oh, and the new ability to throw weapons at an opponent is oddly addictive. I especially like doing it when I'm right next to them. And even though you can't technically slam people onto items like ring steps as they just kind of clip through them, they still included a sadistically satisfying sound effect for it. Which of course makes it that much more fun to do. But if you're looking for something that you actually can slam your opponent through, why not a table? And not just your standard folding table, I mean, those are here too, but how about an announce table? Or even a freaking pool table? And that brings us to backstage areas. A first for the series, and only the second WWF game to do so behind Smackdown on the PlayStation. I mean, there was In Your House, but that took place like in city streets and stuff. You can take the action up to the entrance set just to tombstone your opponent on the stage, or drag their carcass up into the back of an 18-wheeler to give them one hell of a last ride. There's even a bar back here. Yes, a bar. Backstage. In an arena. This was seriously a fun addition to the series that really added a lot of replay value for the hardcore demographic that the product was aimed at during this era. If the cage match looks a bit different to you, well, that would be due to the fact that it's a bit different. The short-lived black cage that was featured in WrestleMania 2000 was replaced by the chain link variation that we all know today. Because of this denser structure, we also see the side closest to the camera made completely transparent during most of the match. Other than that, it's still massively tall, you still climb out of it to win, and don't forget to build up that attitude meter or else you'll be falling. A lot. The ladder match is all brand new here, and just as you've probably guessed, the goal is to set up the ladder, climb to the top, and retrieve the briefcase, or title if it is in fact on the line. Using said ladder as a weapon is not only allowed but also highly recommended. And just like with the cage match, your button mashing abilities will need to be up to par if you plan on snagging that item atop. On top of that, you'll want to make sure that your opponent has a substantial amount of damage to ensure he doesn't get up and, well, see, there you go. You could also be a cheap bastard and throw your opponent out of the ring for an easy victory, but I mean, who really wants to actually win like that? We also see the special referee match included here, which allows the player to take control as the authority of the match. This was something that was always a bit more entertaining in a multiplayer setting, in my opinion. Nothing like having some friends over, officiating their match, and giving them the old screw job. Well, that sounded weird. I mean, not... Wait a minute. If I select Earl Hebner, is it technically still a guest referee? There's also the Iron Man match, where the player to score the most pinfalls and submissions within the allotted time will reign victorious. As well as Survival Mode, where you'll attempt to outlast 100 other wrestlers as you pin, submit, and throw your enemies over the top rope. King of the Ring mode even returns here, and I think I've played it once. No, but seriously, is this a mode that people used a lot? I'd really genuinely like to know. And of course, no WWF game from the time would be complete without the
Royal Rumble.
Though it seems a bit odd that you can't select 30 participants, as the options here are in increments of 4, so the closest you could get would be 28 or 32. I don't know, it just seems kind of weird. There aren't as many gameplay options as SmackDown, and the amount of match types offered up in the upcoming SmackDown 2 Know Your Role would blow this out of the water, no doubt. But what we do get here works, and works well. And another thing that works well is the game's Create a Wrestler mode, which has been greatly improved over the previous installment. Just step into the Smackdown Mall and take a look at the extensive collection of faces, clothing options, and moves to be had. With a lot more original attire and equipment offered up here, it's now easier to create those superstars that weren't included in the game, or that original creation thought up from your wildest, sickest imagination. They even left in some of the thumbnail photos of wrestlers that got cut during development, so guys like the Headbangers, Midian, and others can see the light of day. And for some reason, the Blob from Clay Fighter? Yeah. You can also now create female wrestlers as well, something that wasn't possible in the previous title. And as mentioned before, the sheer selection of moves and taunts should be enough to satisfy just about any creator's needs. The Create a Belt mode from last year doesn't return here, but given how sparse that inclusion was, its removal probably didn't ruffle too many feathers. Hell, maybe it did, I don't know. I'm sure somebody's pissed about it. The game's big mode this year is Championship, and I have to say that they really improved upon the Road to WrestleMania mode that we received just a year earlier in WrestleMania 2000. Because where that one basically featured a very long series of matches with very little narrative offered up in between, this one puts heavy emphasis on storylines. And these stories aren't just cookie-cutter clones either, as the player chooses which championship they'd like to contend for, giving for more than just one way to experience this mode. This is one of the first wrestling games that I can remember giving me a truly in-depth level of engagement in a story mode, and while it would be trumped by later releases, it was still a breath of fresh air at the time. You'll run into altercations backstage, become the next victim of a rival's reign of power, align with other superstars to fight the greater evil, and all sorts of other shenanigans along the way. It's really all quite the experience, and as I mentioned, I can still remember, very vividly in fact, being absolutely glued to this mode when I first received this game. I will say, however, the 2-on-1 handicap matches with no tag format, are these really necessary? I mean, I can't get up, okay? I can't. God damn! The biggest downfall, though, well, it would be that little flaw that came packed into many copies of the game. You know, the one where you lose all your data and you have to continuously start the mode over. Now, this didn't affect every single cartridge of the initial release. I, for one, was lucky enough to never experience this, despite owning it since launch. But THQ did eventually release a second version that fixed this bug. In addition to winning championships, this mode is also where you'll earn cash. Cash that can be spent in the
Smackdown Mall.
This glorious place is where you'll find not only the create and edit modes, but also the shop, a place to purchase new wrestlers, arenas, outfits, moves, weapons, and other goodies for your created wrestler. Not only did they include a decent selection of original attires, but we see some outfits for wrestlers not featured on the game's roster, like Droz's shorts, these glorious Kevin Nash pants, Yokozuna's tights, Gangrel's shirt, and a Headbanger's shirt, just to name a few. Not to mention additional outfits for some of the wrestlers that are in the game, so you can slap those green tights back on Mr. Helmsley, or relive the early days of the Dead Man. They even have Mankind's early gear. As a huge fan of creating and customizing, these inclusions came greatly appreciated. It's also nice to be able to pick and choose what you unlock, so, for example, if you're really just looking for one specific arena and could care less about getting the others, you can jump straight into unlocking it. I mean, the choice is yours. This also adds to the replay value of the championship mode, because many of us, well, we want it all, and we won't stop until we've unlocked every last item here, and we will grind our fingers into dust in the process. So, how did the game fare with the critics? Well, Game Informer gave it a 9.5, which is damn impressive. IGN gave it a 9, and they pretty much hated any N64 game that wasn't developed by Nintendo. GamePro gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. And EGM rated it at 8.17? Wait, 0.17? What's that about? Many applauded the gameplay, the updated story mode, the additional create features, but it wasn't all praise, as some publications made note of shortcomings as well. Uh-oh, here we go. Such as slowdown when 4 wrestlers are on the screen at once, which was a thing, and GamePro made mention of the graphics feeling dated, while Nintendo Power even complained that the game was basically too easy to play, stating that it took little skill to complete. Have they seen the little option in the menu there? Anyway. Regardless, it would become the best-selling WWF game for the N64 and the 3rd best-selling wrestling title in general on the console, behind WCW NWO Revenge and WCW vs. NWO World Tour, selling right around 1.1 million copies. And while that's close to the sales figures of WrestleMania 2000, remember that game saw a worldwide release, while this one didn't make it to Japan, so that's pretty impressive. Hell, it sold slightly more than both F-Zero X and Pilot Wings 64. Can that be real? So you'd think a sequel would be in order, right? Well, that was the plan, at least that's what many say. WWF Backlash was said to have been 30% complete by the time it was cancelled. But there is so much conflicting information about the game at this point that who really knows? There are rumors of a screenshot of the game that exists in an issue of GamePro that nobody can seem to find, which is kind of weird. If it's out there, why can't we find it? And in 2020, Sanders Keel, a producer for THQ, confirmed that the game never actually existed, as there were no further WWF games planned on the console after No Mercy. But again, who knows what's fact or fiction here? All we can say for sure is that Aki would never develop another WWF title, which truly is a shame. Nintendo's next console, the GameCube, would feature WWF WrestleMania 18 as the promotion's debut on the platform, though it couldn't quite live up to what we saw back on the Nintendo 64. Though these games would improve drastically with each release and become fan favorites in their own right. But what could have been if Aki continued development for the old purple Nintendo box? What would that have looked like? They would go on to develop 2 fantastic Def Jam titles, as well as 2 pretty underrated Ultimate Muscle games. While Yuke's would become THQ's new dev team for its wrestling titles, spanning many consoles for many years. Sin Sophia, the former Aki Corporation, is still creating games to this day, though I couldn't tell you what any of them are. It's like they work exclusively with these anime-style games. I don't know what's going on there. And I would assume that the team that created those glorious wrestling titles many years ago are no longer together, if working in the industry at all anymore. But it's still truly sad that they couldn't squeak out a few more grapplers while they were still in their prime. We can at least be thankful for what we got, because thanks to Aki and THQ, the Nintendo 64 will be remembered as one of the greatest consoles for wrestling titles. WCW vs. NWO World Tour, Virtual Pro Wrestling 64, WCW NWO Revenge, WWF WrestleMania 2000, Virtual Pro Wrestling 2, and of course, WWF No Mercy. I personally would like to say thank you to everybody that worked on these titles for creating unforgettable childhood memories that will never leave me. And of course, thanks to you guys for watching. I hope that you enjoyed this one. It was a blast to revisit, and I hope that you enjoyed it as much as I did. If you could please drop a like, I would greatly appreciate it. And of course, I love to chit-chat with all of you, so leave a comment below if the mood shall strike. Until next time, folks, I wish you all well. And bye-bye now.